Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
There is a sacred silence that echoes through the pages of history, whispering truths that many are reluctant to hear. Among the dust-covered scrolls, faded parchments, and weather-worn archaeological relics lies one of the most profound and controversial questions in biblical and historical scholarship. Were the original Israelites black? This is not a question born of mere speculation or racial pride. It is a question born of necessity, a quest for truth, identity, and justice. It challenges centuries of dominant narratives, theological distortions, colonial influence, and Eurocentric revisionism that have painted the biblical world with colors not true to its origins. The question touches not just on skin color but on culture, geography, politics, and the long legacy of slavery and racial ideologies. The answer, if we dare to seek it honestly, requires a deep journey back through time. A journey through the sun-drenched lands of Africa and the Near East, through ancient Egyptian records, through the Babylonian captivities, through Roman occupations, and even through the forced conversions and diasporas of the medieval world. It demands an interrogation of ancient texts, modern scholarship, genetic evidence, archaeological findings, and oral traditions. Many have been led to believe that the Israelites, the chosen people of the Bible, were European-looking, pale-skinned, and straight-haired. This image, deeply entrenched in Western religious art and cinematic depictions, is more reflective of Renaissance imaginations than of Middle Eastern or African realities. The truth, however, may be radically different and perhaps more uncomfortable for some. In a time when historical narratives are being re-examined and reclaimed, this article endeavors to uncover the possibility, indeed the probability, that the original Israelites were black people. Not simply people of color in a vague sense, but distinctly African in appearance and heritage. To do this, we must first understand the historical, geographical, and cultural world in which they lived, and how centuries of erasure have hidden their image from the collective memory of humanity. To understand the ethnicity of the original Israelites, one must begin with geography. Ancient Israel was located in the southern Levant, nestled between Egypt, the Arabian Desert, and Mesopotamia. It is an area that has been the cradle of civilizations for millennia. But more importantly, it lies within a region historically populated by peoples with deep African and Afro-Asiatic roots. The Hebrew Bible makes frequent reference to nations and tribes whose locations were in or around Africa: Egypt, Ethiopia, Cush, Canaan, and Midian. The patriarch Abraham, considered the father of the Israelite nation, is said to have originated from Ur of the Chaldeans, an ancient city in Mesopotamia, which was heavily influenced by Sumerian and Afro-Asiatic populations. Abraham traveled south into Canaan and eventually into Egypt, regions populated by darker-skinned peoples. The intermingling of these populations, Canaanites, Egyptians, Cushites, and later Israelites, strongly suggests a shared or related ethnic background. Egypt, where the Israelites famously sojourned and were enslaved, is not only geographically African, but culturally so. Despite modern attempts to divorce ancient Egypt from its African roots, the evidence, artistic, linguistic, genetic, and anthropological, tells a different story. Numerous Egyptian frescoes, tomb paintings, and reliefs show Semitic peoples like the Hebrews with brown to dark brown skin, wearing garments distinct from the lighter-skinned Libyans or Indo-Europeans. Ancient Egyptian texts referred to various peoples based on phenotype and geography. The Cushites, modern-day Sudanese, were clearly black, and many Semitic tribes were depicted with features resembling those of African peoples, including tightly coiled hair, broad noses, and full lips. If the Israelites lived for generations in Egypt, intermarried with surrounding peoples, and emerged from that region, it is unlikely that they were fair-skinned. Rather, they likely resembled their Egyptian neighbors more than they did Northern Europeans. The Bible itself provides several clues that challenge the Eurocentric image of the Israelites. While the scriptures do not focus extensively on physical appearance, certain descriptions and events imply the Israelites were not white. In the Song of Solomon, often interpreted as a poetic allegory of divine love, the speaker proclaims, "I am black and comely, O daughters of Jerusalem, Song of Solomon 1 verse 5. The Hebrew word used here for black is shaker, which literally means dark-colored or blackened. This verse has long troubled Eurocentric commentators, some of whom tried to reinterpret the word metaphorically or suggest it referred to a spiritual condition. But the context is clear. It speaks of a proud declaration of beauty associated with dark skin. Another powerful example comes from Moses himself. In Numbers 12, Moses is criticized by his siblings, Miriam and Aaron, for marrying a Cushite woman. Cush, known as Nubia or modern-day Sudan, was inhabited by dark-skinned African people. The anger directed at Moses was likely racially motivated, suggesting that the Israelites were not drastically different in appearance from the Cushites, but that marrying outside their tribal lines, especially from a known African region, was controversial. Ironically, Miriam's punishment was leprosy, her skin turned as white as snow. Numbers 12:10, a poetic form of divine justice in light of her criticism. The implication is significant. If whiteness was considered a form of punishment or deformity in this context, then dark skin was clearly the norm among the Israelites. Furthermore, the prophet Jeremiah lamented, "Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine." Lamentations 5 verse 10. While some argue this refers to sunburn or famine-related illness, the imagery reinforces the presence of dark skin among the Israelites as a natural condition that could become even darker under harsh circumstances. Throughout the Old Testament, Israelites interacted with African nations in ways that reveal a deeper ethnic kinship than is usually acknowledged. Cushites appear often, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies, but always as part of the biblical world. King David employed Cushite messengers. The prophet Zephaniah identified himself as the son of a Cushite. Even the infamous Queen of Sheba, who visited King Solomon, came from the regions of Ethiopia or Yemen, both associated with Afro-Arabian peoples. Joseph, sold into slavery by his brothers, rose to power in Egypt and married Asenath, the daughter of an Egyptian priest. Their children, Ephraim and Manasseh, became 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. Moses, raised in the Egyptian royal court, bore the influence of African culture and ideology. When one considers the intermarriages, shared customs, and prolonged presence in African lands, the ethnic makeup of the Israelites appears inseparably tied to Africa. Moreover, the biblical Canaanites, the very people whose land the Israelites entered, were descended from Ham, traditionally linked to Africa. Though modern scholars dispute simplistic racial categories based on the biblical table of nations, ancient Hebrew writers clearly viewed these neighboring peoples as ethnically close, if not indistinguishable, from themselves. From the Renaissance onward, Western art began to depict biblical figures in starkly European terms. Jesus became a pale, blue-eyed man with flowing brown hair. Moses, David, and even the Israelites in Egypt were shown as European peasants or royalty. This transformation coincided with European colonial expansion and the rise of racialized theology, which used a whitewashed Bible to justify slavery, imperialism, and the suppression of African heritage. The idea that the Israelites were white served a political purpose. If God's chosen people were imagined as European, then European colonizers could see themselves as heirs to divine favor. If, on the other hand, the Israelites were black, such an idea would radically upend the racial hierarchies that sustained the transatlantic slave trade, apartheid, and Jim Crow laws. This is perhaps why many early depictions of black saints and biblical characters were systematically removed, hidden, or destroyed. The so-called Black Madonnas of Europe, ancient paintings of Mary and Jesus with unmistakably African features, were often repainted or marginalized. In truth, early Christian and Jewish communities in Africa and the Near East retained these more accurate depictions until Western influence redefined the visual narrative. Even after the fall of ancient Israel and Judah, the descendants of the Israelites spread throughout Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Large populations of Jews settled in Ethiopia, Sudan, Libya, and the Niger River regions. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia, the Lemba of southern Africa, and the Igbo Jews of Nigeria all claim descent from ancient Israelites. While these claims are sometimes disputed, Genetic studies have shown surprising links between these African communities and the Levantine Semitic gene pool. The Lemba, for example, carry the Cohen modal haplotype associated with the ancient Jewish priestly line at significantly higher rates than many European Jews. The Beta Israel maintained rigorous religious customs for centuries before rejoining the wider Jewish world. These communities were often dismissed or sidelined in European Jewish circles, viewed as curiosities or impostors. But their very existence across such vast and distant African lands speaks to an ancient diaspora rooted in both faith and phenotype. To ask whether the original Israelites were black is not to ask whether they were exclusively African in the modern racial sense. It is to ask whether the people described in the Bible, shaped by African geography, intertwined with African nations, and depicted with dark skin in their own texts, have been misrepresented by centuries of cultural appropriation and historical distortion. The evidence, archaeological, linguistic, biblical, and genetic, strongly suggests that the original Israelites were indeed people of color, many of whom would today be identified as black. They were not European. They were not pale-skinned. They emerged from the ancient Afroasiatic world, a world far more diverse and brown than the sanitized images found in Western churches and Hollywood films. This truth matters. It matters because it restores dignity to African peoples long excluded from the story of salvation. It matters because it challenges the false doctrines of white supremacy. And it matters because history, when told honestly, has the power to heal wounds and awaken forgotten roots. In a world grappling with questions of race, identity, and justice, it is time to confront the sacred silence and listen to the voices buried beneath centuries of lies. The Israelites were not white. And maybe, just maybe, they were black.